that air wants to go back in? How is it that air wants to come back out? And when we talk about air or gases going into the body, we call it inspiration. And when gases are leaving the body, we call it expiration. I've had it in the past before. I've had students, I'm like, explain to me. This is not a short answer on your exam. And I'm like, but I've had it in the past where I'm like, explain to me, inspiration. And students that have no idea, they're like, feeling inspired. You know, I'm like, explain to me expiration. Things past their due dates, you know, like expiration. And I'm like, no, you have no idea what's going on. Inspiration means air going in. Expiration means air going out. And then it all is because of pressure. It's all because of pressure. I'm getting a new clicker. The company's sending me a new one. So I don't have to keep coming over here and clicking. Yeah, they got, it'll probably come. They said I was in the mail already, though. So reason why air goes into the lungs, air comes out of the lung is all pressure. It's all pressure. And so today we do have to talk a little bit about, well, what are all the pressures? Where are all these pressures that is causing air to go in and air to go out? Now, atmospheric pressure is the pressure of the air around you. There's pressure to the air around you. And the air around you has a pressure of approximately 760 millimeters of mercury at sea level. And we're just going to make the assumption we're just at sea level. We're not totally, but for our numbers, we're at sea level. Now, anytime we talk about any other pressures in our lungs, it's really, how does that differ from air pressure around us? How is it different? Is it more or less than 760? If it's less than 760, so we say it's a negative respiratory pressure. It's just less than 760. If we say it's greater than atmospheric pressure, or more than 760, we say that's a positive respiratory pressure. And if it's right at 760, we'd say it's a 0, because that's not above, it's not below, it's right at atmospheric pressure. Everything's back, you know, right around, what is it when we're comparing it to that 760 atmospheric pressure? Now, your lungs, again, not artistic, there's my lung. Your lung itself has a pressure inside of it. It's called your intrapulmonary, sometimes called alveolar pressure. It's like in the lung, in the alveoli, where gas exchange is taking place. And the pressure inside of there, we call as big P for you know, the pressure. And then you'll see PUL for pulmonary pressure. Now, that pressure inside of there will vary, but it will always go back to 760. That pressure, you know, like increases and decreases as air goes in and air goes out, but it eventually always equals right at 760. I wish I made quicker. Extra steps. Around the lungs, we have a pleural cavity. And there is a pressure in there too. It's called intrapleural pressure. Intra means within. So in that space of your pleural, big P, and then it gets little IP for intrapleural pressure. Now, that can also fluctuate with breathing. However, it's always a negative pressure. And when I say negative, it means it's always less than 760. Always. If it hits 760 or goes above that, your lungs will collapse. It means the pressure is pushing in on your lungs. We have to have this intrapleural pressure less than 760. We want that pressure almost to be like a vacuum trying to pull our lungs as big as they can go. If the pressure gets too big, it pushes down in your lungs, and there's not a lot of tissue to your lungs. It's a lot of airspace in there. And I'm like, and that pressure will collapse those lungs. So it always has to have a negative pressure. So it always has to be below atmospheric pressure, and it also has to be below that intrapulmonary pressure, which at some point always equals to the atmospheric pressure. If any type of fluid increases in there, if you add fluid, that will increase the pressure and it will push in on the lungs, causing your lung collapse. Now, two things are causing that intrapleural pressure. And I'm like, two things are, well, they're opposing forces. One is helping push the lungs in, and one is helping, you know, pull the lungs out to help maintain that negative pressure. Things that are pushing, increasing this pressure and trying to push the lungs in. One is that the lungs themselves are stretchy. And when the lungs stretch, it's just like a rubber band, they do want to recoil back. And so just the fact the lungs want to recoil back, that will increase that pressure. And I'll try to get to surface tension. And the actual alveoli that are inside of here that's doing the gas exchange have what's known as surface tension. There is a fluid, a water-based fluid, you're made of water, and a water-based fluid that's in the lungs. Water wants to stick to water. It always does. This is why it hangs out together. It always wants to stick to water. Can some bugs walk on water? Yes, why? Yeah, water wants to stick to water. And those bugs weigh, so little they don't break the bonds between water. Water wants to stick to water. That's surface tension. The fact that water wants to stick to water on the lungs pulls the lungs down and doesn't allow our alveoli to stretch and break that bonds between the water. So those are things that are really trying to make the lungs collapse. However, though, we do have outward forces that pull our lungs out. And our chest cavity is elastic. And it helps us inflate our chest so that we can try to pull, and those lungs outward. So there's a couple things that are creating that negative pressure in there. Well, one's creating a positive pressure. Luckily, the negative pressure will win. Now, if your intrapleural pressure is greater than the intrapulmonary, which is also the same as your atmospheric pressure, and your lungs will collapse. When we talk about the difference between the two pressures, we call it transpulmonary. Trans means across. If you take a transatlantic boat ride, you go across the Atlantic Ocean. And so the transpulmonary pressure is really, what is the difference between this pressure and this pressure? Now, I like numbers. When I start looking at that, it's numbers and equations, but I don't even have a number in there. So your pulmonary pressure inside your lungs will eventually always make it back to atmospheric pressure. And number-wise, what's atmospheric pressure? 760. Your intrapleural pressure is always negative. It's always less than that. And it's usually 4 less than that. Your intrapleural pressure is usually 756 millimeters of mercury. And again, you're like, that's not a huge difference. Doesn't matter, it's negative. Now, that means the transpulmonary pressure is this number minus that number, and what is 760 minus 756? 4. And so your transpulmonary pressure is 4. There is a difference of 4. Now, the greater the difference, like if this was 755 or 752 or 750 or whatever, the greater the difference, the more the lungs will expand and enlarge. And you can take deeper breaths. You can really make, nice, big, huge, deep lungs. Here's the picture, kind of what I drew. And so your intrapulmonary pressure is usually 760 millimeters of mercury. This is just meaning it's the same 0 as atmospheric pressure. That space in the pleural, and is usually around 756, which is less than, 4 less than atmospheric pressure. The difference between the two is 4. 760 minus 756. But things can happen to that negative pressure. Things can happen to that intrapleural pressure and cause what's known as atelectasis. That's lung collapse. And it's always because that intrapleural pressure is above 760. Now, it could be because you have some type of plugged bronchioles that will collapse everything down, but usually it's something that happened to this, I don't want to say cavity, and that this pleural, cavity, that's fluid-filled cavity, something happened here. Something damaged it, and it's usually air gets in. If air gets in, if you add air to a balloon, what happens to the pressure? It increases. You're inflating it, you're adding pressure. Well, if air gets in, that's going to increase pressure, which means it's going to go above 760, and it's going to cause lung collapse. Now, it's called a pneumothorax. It just means there's now air in that pleural cavity. Air is going to increase that pressure. It will cause lung collapse. Things that can cause it, because I've got a picture. And I'm like, sometimes it's wound. Sometimes, I'm like, I had my, a stab wound. And I'm like, some type of knife wound. If you have damage to that pleural cavity, air could get in. And I'm like, sometimes it's spontaneous. It just happens. Sometimes in, like, I don't know, it literally just happens. Usually it's older people that can happen, and it can cause lung collapse. Sometimes as you go in and are just having, serious issues, you're in a car accident, your body's fighting everything else, it's more likely to happen, spontaneously happen then. During surgeries, if they nick it, it could happen. And I'm like, but what happens is air goes in this lighter pink area, fill with air. And so they're filling with air, which is going to change that pressure. Instead of -4 now, it's going to change it to, equal to atmospheric pressure. It will cause that lung to collapse. Now, when this lung collapses, does it affect the other lung? No. And I'm like, you have two lungs. They're each sitting in their own separate pleural cavity. So I'm like, you'd still have a lung ready to go, still trying to breathe. Now, so I'm like, we got our pressures down. Things that actually make the air go in or make the air go out. So we know we have to have that negative pressure in there to try to keep our lungs open and not collapse. But the pressure in our lungs changes with volume. That's the main basics on why you're breathing in right now. We are going to change volume, and when we change the volume of anything, pressure changes. And air is going to always want to go from high pressure to low pressure. Air doesn't like being under high pressure. If you have filled up a balloon and you put lots of air under pressure in the balloon, and then you let go of the opener of the balloon, where's the air going to want to go? It's going to want to go out. Air doesn't like being under pressure. It's the basics on how we breathe. Air does not like to be under pressure. It always wants to go from high pressure to low pressure. Always. All our body is doing is creating a volume difference, and volume changes the pressure. Now, the volume versus pressure is a law. There's several laws throughout this chapter, just as an FYI. Yes, I know at least one of them is on your next exam. First law, and I'm like, we only get to one law today, is Boyle's law. This is the law that talks about pressure and volume have an inverse relationship. And this is, I was trying to find something in my office. I'm like, how can I demonstrate it? I was looking for an empty water bottle, but this is almost empty. If I take my water bottle, or my pop bottle, and it's the same volume, I've got the cap tight, but if I squeeze on it, I'm not that strong. If I squeeze on it, I decrease the volume. However, has the air changed, like the volume of air? No, and I'm like, but I am going to make it smaller because I'm squeezing in on it. When you make the volume smaller, what's going to happen to the air pressure? It will go up. It's an inverse. If you decrease volume, pressure goes up. If I could somehow make this expand and I increase volume, what will happen to the pressure? It will go down. They're always in inverse. If I increase volume, pressure goes down. If I decrease volume, pressure goes up. That's Boyle's law. That's the basics. They're inverse. They're opposite of each other for the relationship. Now, inspiration, I got time. I'll get through what I want to today. Inspiration is an active process, which means you require muscles to bring air in. Now, your lung, this is your lung at rest. Again, I'm not artistic. That's your lung at rest. However, when you breathe in, you right now are not forcing air to go in. All you're doing when you are going to breathe in is that you're going to increase volume. How you do that? You have a diaphragm right here underneath the lung. In that rest, your diaphragm sits at an arch. When your diaphragm contracts, that arch flattens. What did that do to the volume? It increased it. Now, also, other than the fact that when your diaphragm contracts, it flattens, and I'm like, you're also going to contract the muscles between your rib cage, which will inflate your rib cage. I'm going to erase the top part. So when your muscles contract, you've now increased the volume. What has that done to the pressure? It has decreased the pressure. and it has decreased the pressure enough, it is less than, that's my less than symbol, atmospheric pressure. It's less than the air around you. And so if atmospheric pressure, this is the atmospheric pressure all around you, it's 760 millimeters of mercury. It, again, air doesn't like to be under pressure. It always wants to go from high pressure to low pressure. Air will go into that lower air pressure area of your lungs. Naturally. You're not forcing it in. You're not creating a suction. You're not walking around like, and I'm like, all that you're doing is when you breathe, you just increase the volume, which decreases the pressure less than atmospheric pressure. And air just goes into your body. It just happens. It just always wants to go from high pressure to low pressure. You just created a pressure difference because you changed the volume. And so air will flow into the lung because it goes down its pressure gradient, meaning it wants to go from high pressure around you into that lower pressure in your lungs until it gets to 760 in there as well. But it did require, it's an active process, it did require contraction of muscles. Now, this is just showing that when your muscles contract, the diaphragm will move down. It's not the greatest picture, I like mine. And I'm like, your muscles will contract and just lift the whole body, the whole thing up. I like mine. Now, if you're like, well, there are things that can force air to go in. Vigorous exercise, and I'm like, you're going to use additional muscles to try to increase that volume to get air to go in. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease was going to generally require additional muscles to get air in so that we get enough oxygen in. That just requires extra muscles. Now it requires muscles called your scalenes. They're underneath your pectoralis muscles. The sternocleidomastoid can help lift up the thoracic cage more, and your pectoralis minor can also try to lift out that thoracic cage. But it requires additional muscle, which means you're going to be more tired. And I'm like, it's tiring to breathe. Expiration is the exact opposite of inspiration. Now, it's a passive process, which means it doesn't require any energy whatsoever. All that's going to happen is your muscles are going to relax. And so we're going to go in reverse. Your diaphragm is going to relax, and it's going to start to form that bowed shape. All of your intercostal muscles are going to relax, and your thoracic cage shrinks back down. And when you decrease volume, what happens to pressure? It's going to increase pressure, and it's going to increase that pressure so that it is greater. I don't even want to say equal to. Greater than 760 millimeters of mercury. You created pressure that's higher than atmospheric pressure. So where's that air going to want to go? Out. Air doesn't want to be in there. It's under pressure when it's in your lungs, so it just leaves your body. All you're doing when you breathe is just creating a volume difference. Now, force expiration. If I'm like, I'm going to try to push out and breathe out the biggest breath, and I'm like, that's going to require additional muscles. That's forced expiration. That's going to use abdominal muscles to like force out additional air. Can you force out all of the air in your lungs? No, or they would collapse. What would happen? And I'm like, but you can force out more air, but it requires additional muscles. This is just showing some of the, some of the volumes that change. My note, you breathe in and out about 500 milliliters of air with every breath. What's this? It's got to be pretty close. 500 milliliters. You breathe it, every time you're taking a breath right now, you breathe in and out about this much. My note, your intrapulmonary pressure will always equal right at 760. Your intrapleural pressure always is going to stay negative. And like, sometimes it's more negative than not, but it's always negative with every breath you take. And that's where I wanted to at least get to. I wasn't sure where I would get to.